I'm joined down here by Rosalind McKenna, and Rosalind is the coordinator of the Human Rights Programme in Ireland for Amnesty International. Rosalind, welcome.
Thank you very much. Nice to see you.
Rosalind, the issue we're interested in talking about today is the Constitutional Convention, which has been announced in the last few, well, it's been updated a bit in the last couple of days. But before we talk about that, could I ask you, I tend to see a constitution, or at least the role of a constitution, as, if you like, defining the powers of government, or the role of government, and the relationship between government and governed. How do you feel about that?
That's normally how constitutions are viewed, that it is both what are the parameters by which government is established and what are the institutions and mechanisms of the state, how does a parliament work, for example. But it's also about the relationship, like you say, between the state, and government is part of that, and individuals within that state, that it's about the relationship between those two parties, what is expected of government and what is expected of the people within that state. So it can be both the basic law of the land, but also it quite often speaks to the values of that state and what the state hopes to achieve in the way that it goes about its business.
Sure. Listening to your voice, you're from Caledonia. Now, when we were growing up in this country, we were always told, probably a bit from the nationalist point of view, we were superior because we had a written constitution and Britain didn't have a written constitution. Having been in the environment where there is both, how do you feel about written versus unwritten?
I think first and foremost, I'm fascinated by the written constitution. When I first moved to Ireland, and I would have studied in Ireland, but when I first moved and was working here and was talking to people about Bunreacht, one of the things that really struck me was the ownership that people felt over that constitution, that it was something of relevance to them. They hadn't necessarily spent much time reading it, and I think then when you do open people's eyes to these are some of the provisions in the Constitution, it sparks debate. Oh, why do we say that? Why is this thing in our Constitution? And I think it's an interesting statement of who a country is at a particular time that you perhaps don't have where you don't have a written constitution. But that's not to say that a constitution remains immobile over time. The very heart of a constitution often is that it can be updated in line with the progress of that country.
A couple of points come to mind just hearing that, Rosalind. I mean, very few people alive these days would have voted for it. Certainly the 1937 Constitution. Even fewer would have voted for the 1922. And even then, if it hadn't required a two-thirds majority, it wouldn't have got up. It wasn't overwhelmingly accepted. So I'm just curious as to why people feel that ownership over something they really have very little input to.
It's interesting because there were a number of iterations of the Irish Constitution, but if we think of the current Constitution, the 37 Constitution, actually if you look at the level of turnouts for various referenda over the years, you have various degrees of turnout to vote, but actually the turnout was very high to vote for the 37 Constitution, so there was an element of people voting for this document and taking ownership of that. And I think regardless of the particular issues at hand, when you see the level of debate that occurs around any constitutional referendum, people care about what is in the Irish Constitution, and that it's not a completely abstract document, but it's important that that document remains relevant to people in Ireland, and that's why it has to be amended over time.
Perhaps I'm showing myself here when I say the Constitution I always put forward as the benchmark is the American Constitution, or the US Constitution. The US Constitution is over 200 years old, yet it seems to me a document that has very modern applicability, whereas the Irish Constitution goes back to 1922, and it seems to me that that's a documentation that reflects a period before I was born.
I think different constitutions will have different histories, and some will last longer than others, but I think at the same time it's not an overly ancient constitution, it's still relatively new. And actually at the time when the Constitution was being written, if you think about some of the principles around democracy and around human rights in the Constitution, that actually they were very progressive at the time that they were written into the Irish Constitution. They were part and parcel of that Constitution, and it's something that's been lauded by different writers and different historians, that actually it's the fact that the Constitution has those principles around democracy and has those principles around human rights, and that it can be reviewed over time, that actually adds to the value of the Irish Constitution. So I wouldn't say in any way that the Irish Constitution is outdated or immaterial. In fact, it's the important question is how do we make sure that it maintains that that relevance to people, and that's why it can be updated.
The distinction I would make between the two constitutions, the US and the Irish, is that I've always seen the US as an architecture for government, whereas I've always seen the Irish one as an architecture for politics. Not necessarily one and the same thing. What's your view on that? Is that you seem to be saying that because of the dynamic nature of the Irish constitution, somehow or other, it didn't matter if we got it wrong then, we're getting it right now. Is that a fair interpretation of what you're saying then, Rosalind?
Well, firstly, I'm not an Irish constitutional scholar. There are far greater heads than me, with close to this office in central Dublin, and that we've got some very strong academic scholars. But I think what we have to remember is that whether it's about the political provisions in the Constitution or the governance provisions in the Constitution, the piece that matters for Amnesty International is the rights protections within the Constitution. And that's why it's laudable that there are rights protections, but we have to make sure that they are up to date and meaningful for people.
Okay. Well, that raises then, you're saying that the strength of the Constitution is the fact that it is amendable. Do we need a new one?
I wouldn't say that necessarily there's a call for a new constitution in Ireland. That's not something that Amnesty International would be calling for, because obviously a constitution deals with many, many issues that would be out with the mandate of Amnesty International as a human rights organisation. What we would say is that the human rights provisions need to be brought up to date. When the Constitution has been reviewed before by the 1996 Constitutional Review Group, one of the things that they said was actually this Constitution came before a lot of the modern human rights protections that Ireland since signed up to, or those human rights commitments were really only created in the mid-60s after the birth of the Irish Constitution. So there are gaps in the Constitution where it doesn't reflect the commitments that Ireland has made since. So perhaps there is scope for bringing it up to date in that respect.
At the moment in Ireland, unlike the US system, we have a legislature and an executive, which are essentially one, and then we have the judiciary, which is, if you like, the protection of the people. How do you feel about that arrangement within the Irish Constitution? Is it a recipe for, shall we say, upholding those human rights, or is it literally no more than a lawyer's goldmine?
Well, no, absolutely. We wouldn't say it's a lawyer's goldmine. Each of the strands of government, whether it's the executive, the legislature, or the judiciary, would all have a role in upholding the provisions in the Constitution, including the human rights provisions. And I think it's important that we clarify that it's not for the judiciary to take a back seat on these issues, that the judiciary day in, day out, makes judgments on how the state conducts itself, and that should be no different in terms of how it adjudicates on human rights matters. So the court shouldn't be scared of human rights matters, but actually they should be there as a way to check what government is doing and how it's protecting people.
Well, it seems then that a lot of the human rights issues you and I may be talking about here, government can introduce them, whether irrespective of the Constitution, but is the Constitution in some instances a barrier to or an obstacle to progress rather than, shall we say, a facilitator of progress?
It's not always necessarily that it's a barrier. There would be some concerns that some of the constitutional provisions, perhaps because they're given constitutional status, then they have an extra weight as they should, but perhaps there have been concerns that the right to private property in the Constitution needs to be balanced out somewhat with, for example, a right to housing. But it's not so much that the constitutional provisions are a barrier. What we would see is that they should be strengthened so that provisions can be put in the Constitution that stand the test of time, that they're more sustainable than simply if they're a matter of government legislation or the particular policy of the day. But the Constitution is a statement over what should be provided for, what should be protected for people, and that's the standard that we hold government to account. And it has a much more long-lasting effect, perhaps, than legislation that can come and go with the change of government.
Sure. How would you describe the current constitution? Would you describe it as a secular constitution?
That would not be something that Amnesty would take on in terms of how the Constitution provides for religion. What is critical is that in how the Constitution addresses any individuals in the states, or how our government addresses individuals in the states, that it doesn't discriminate on the basis of religion. So there would be those that advocate that some of the religion provisions in the Constitution have to be addressed, but that would not be the priority for Amnesty International.
So when it comes to defining, and classic instances is the areas where we would call private morality, should the Constitution take charge, effectively bring that back down to the individual, because in the previous Constitution it was tended to be defined by public morality.
Well, what's critical is that the Constitution actually is in line with the international human rights standards, and that actually that speaks to provisions like equality and non-discrimination. So when we look at something like discrimination on the basis of religion or sexual orientation, well, human rights law is very clear that those discrimination on that basis is prohibited. So a constitutional provision that is not in line with those standards should be addressed. But more than anything, it's about ensuring that for anyone in Ireland, regardless of their own individual identity, that they are equally protected under the Constitution.
In the final analysis then, the arbiter becomes the European Court of Human Rights, does it not?
Well, no, in actual fact, the European Court of Human Rights has a mandate over the provisions under the European Convention on Human Rights or some of the other Council of Europe treaties. But actually, in many ways, the arbiter for the Irish Constitution is the Irish Supreme Court, but it's still very much a domestic remedy. So what we have to ensure is that the international commitments that Ireland has signed up to are reflected in our Constitution, and then that government and the Supreme Court uphold those protections. So it's about making sure that we do it right in Ireland, and that's the priority.
We have had instances where the Supreme Court has found the government have yet, after a very long time, not implemented the recommendations. I'm particularly thinking of the X case coming out of that. How do we get around that then? I mean, we have a constitution that says one thing, a court that rules another. We then have a government, we're not necessarily objecting, but not putting it in the, giving it the priority it has. Isn't that the problem with the balance of power we've got within the Constitution?
Well, regardless of what issue is at hand, what we have to ensure that government is held accountable, whether it's for the implementation of legislation or for actually reflecting its human rights commitments in national law or national policy. And that's a challenge for all of us working in this field, but also all people living in Ireland, is how do we actually ensure that government bring forward the legislation. You know, we see in many areas where we have had good policy over a number of years, for example around mental health, but that's not necessarily been implemented or enforced, and then that really is about us all campaigning and calling on our TDs and our elected representatives and on our government to put in place the legislation that will deliver on the commitments that it has set itself or has been set for it.
Sure. Yeah. The way I used to describe the existing constitution when it was drawn up to people was that it was an Ireland where there were men and women, that was essentially the way it addressed rights, and there were Protestants, Catholics and Jews, because that were the rights in the original constitution. How far away have we gone from that, or in terms of social thinking, particularly with the issues that Amnesty are trying to raise in relation to the Constitutional Convention?
Well, there are two pieces there. First of all, we also have to think about how the Constitution provides for children, and that's why government must move forward as a priority with the children's rights referendum. We have to make sure that our Constitution adequately protects children. But on the other hand, in Amnesty's more general work around the Constitutional Convention and the rights protections that are missing from the Constitution or that perhaps need updating, one of the concerns is that regardless of whether it's man, woman, Protestant, Catholic, that all individuals living in Ireland are protected by the Constitution, free from discrimination. Now, there are multiple ways in which discrimination manifests itself in Ireland, but it's important that the Constitution itself doesn't enforce any of that discrimination.
Sure. We've had the announcement of a constitutional convention. That doesn't necessarily mean we're going to get a new constitution. What's your feeling on is this something that came out of politics that we're now having to deal with, or is there a burgeoning need for a new constitution out of convention? I don't want to preempt what it might decide.
I think there's a bit of a mix. Before the last election, both Fine Gael and Labour were talking about constitutional reform, and that was either to address specific issues within the constitution, or it was more generally reflecting the need for change that was very apparent in the public discourse. We are in the midst of a crisis, and how do we address that, and what role does the constitution play in that? that since the government took office, as part of the programme for government, they announced the intention to have a constitutional convention, and the resolution to establish that convention is going through the Dáil and the Seanad this week. So that's, for Amnesty International, very welcome that we have a constitutional convention that is going to be examining issues within Burnach na hÉireann, and that there are going to be ordinary citizens of Ireland involved in that process. So the convention is a very, very welcome opportunity, and it's not necessarily about creating a new constitution, but making sure that the constitution that we have is brought up to date and really speaks to the Ireland of today. And that's why we'd be looking for the constitution to be given the mandate, the time and the resources it needs to actually carry out an examination and make recommendations that government can then address.
Sure. You've signed a petition against this. Can you just share with us what's that about?
Well, it's not that Amnesty have sent a petition against the convention. One of the things we have been doing is working with a number of organisations across Ireland around ensuring that the Constitutional Convention is as participative, as inclusive and as meaningful as possible. That those people that are the ordinary citizens that are chosen to sit on the convention really do represent Ireland and the breadth of people in Ireland. That when the Constitutional Convention is actually conducting its business, it does so in a way that consults with people, that ensures that all those voices in Ireland are heard, and also that people are able to engage with the convention in a way to ensure that the convention is as well informed as possible. And finally, that the issues that the convention addresses are really those issues that speak to the concerns of people living in Ireland. So while there are a number of issues that the government has decided are to be examined by the convention, one of the challenges is what are the additional issues that should be examined by the convention. We did some work last year, and around 80% of people say that government should enforce those human rights in Ireland that it is signed up to internationally. And that could be one of the areas for the Constitutional Convention to examine, is bringing the human rights provisions up to date. Similar polling at the time, around 78% to 81% said that the Constitution should protect the right to health and it should protect the right to housing, and the Convention itself should address those issues. So our big concern is that if the people of Ireland support those rights, they support the Convention examining those rights, why are those rights not being examined? And if we look at the political parties, in opposition, Fine Gael and Labour both supported economic, social and cultural rights like the right to health or the right to housing being incorporated into the Constitution. They are silent on whether it should be examined by the Convention, and we have had all opposition parties saying that these are some of the issues that should be examined by the Convention. So there's an appetite out there for the Convention to examine more fundamental issues, and that's what we're calling on government to support.
So how do you feel about that? They've nominated 100 delegates, and I think there's some organisations involved as well. How do you feel about the way they've gone about selecting? Clearly they've had their options have been limited, but Amnesty, I gather, haven't been included in that. Is that correct?
Amnesty wouldn't be calling in any way for Amnesty to have a seat on the Constitutional Convention, or for any civil society organisation to have a seat on the Constitutional Convention. That's not the focus. The focus is ensuring that the 66 individuals who are selected to be in the convention will have 33 parliamentarians and 1 chair, but the 66 individuals will truly represent Ireland, that when they are selected off the electoral register, that we ensure that it does represent the different groups across Ireland. In terms of any organisations, what's important is that the breadth of experience that has been built up on issues by organisations working in the field, that information and that evidence is available to the convention once it's sitting, and that they engage with those groups. There's going to be a huge challenge for the convention to address these issues, but at the same time this is a really interesting model where actually the question of constitutional reform and what should be in our constitution isn't simply happening in a room full of academics and lawyers, but is actually involving the people whose lives are affected by those issues, and fundamentally is a consultation with the people of Ireland before we even get to the question of a referendum.
Sure. I used to go to the National Forum on Europe year after year. It was actually a very nice, shall we say, forum to go to. There were a lot of erudite people, but it ended up just being a talking shop, and particularly when you look at what they said about Nice, what they said about Lisbon, I'm sure most of the people, if we were to play back the recordings, they'd be hugely embarrassed. How do we ensure that a constitutional convention does not become the new National Forum for Europe and just a talk shop where people hear the sound of their own voice and exult at the sound of their own voice, and nothing really positive comes out of it.
Part of it, I actually think, is who's going to end up on the convention. We're going to have a summer where a polling agency is going to be contacting people to be asking whether they would be willing to be part of the Constitutional Convention. And I think that's interesting. Is how do we get into that conversation? Is it one of us that's on the convention? And I wouldn't be as a non-citizen, but who's actually on the convention itself? How do we talk about this in our homes, in our schools, when we're out with friends about what actually our constitution should look like, and bring some of that conversation to bear in the convention? But I think you're right, what's critical is also what comes after the conversation. It's fundamental that we have a conversation about human rights as part of the Constitutional Convention, and we move that debate forward. What are the things that we want to be protected? But it's also vital that what comes out of the convention actually is moved forward by government. The provisions of the resolution which established the convention have set a time frame for the convention to report back to government, and then for government to give some kind of response as to what it intends to do with those recommendations. And I think that's important. We've had constitutional review processes before, and absolutely the discussion is vital. What comes after it is as, if not more important.
Feel free to correct me on this, but I gather that whatever comes out of the convention is only going to be subsidiary to what the government decides anyway. Have I got that slightly askew?
That would be one of the concerns, that actually recommendations can come out of the convention, and it's only if those recommendations or the spirit of those recommendations are supported by government, then it would be put forward to go to a referendum. Now that's one of the challenges, is if we do have very strong recommendations out of the Constitutional Convention, how do we put pressure on government that these issues must be addressed? And I think that's why we all have to have an interest in this process, even if we're not the 66 people on the convention. But what's happening in that room? What is the nature of that conversation? Are there ways in which we can be part of that conversation? And then once we see the recommendations that come out of it, how do we have that conversation with our TDs, with our government, to say, look, these are some very, very strong recommendations. These are recommendations that would fundamentally improve the way that our lives in Ireland are lived from day to day, and that government must move forward to a referendum.
The issues that seem to be of primary focus for Amnesty, if I've got this correct, Rosalind, health and housing. Can you just briefly elaborate on those? Because most people, shall we say, of the non-rights position would say, hold on, these are economic issues, these aren't rights issues at all. You get bad health because, for a whole variety of reasons, it is not the role of the state to provide you tell us, what is the issue about housing?
Well, there's a bit of a mix. I think first and foremost, it's important to realise that these are not rights that Amnesty invented, or that Amnesty in Ireland invented, but these are human rights commitments that the international community agreed on in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, a mouthful, from 1966, and that Ireland signed up to in 1973 and then ratified in 1989, which means that they are agreeing to uphold those rights and protect them for people living in Ireland. The problem is that they've never been brought into Irish law, including in our constitution. So it's very difficult for people to enforce them. But what are those rights? And absolutely, there's a concern is, does the right to health mean that I can sue government if I get sick? And it's not a right to be healthy. But one of the provisions of the right to health would say, first and foremost, you have to have adequate healthcare, and you have to have access to healthcare. So one of the pieces would be, for example, around mental health. How do we ensure that our mental health services in Ireland are actually the best services available, that they're actually adequate to address the mental health needs of those that seek them, and that they're not outdated services, for example, or inappropriate services. So it speaks to the adequacy of our healthcare, but it also speaks to the question of access in healthcare. We have been working in Amnesty around the question of access to healthcare for a number of years now, and one of the questions for us is, can people access healthcare when they need it? And what we see is that 1 in 5 people have been denied or delayed access to healthcare simply because of the cost of that healthcare. So the challenge would be for government to ensure that everyone is able to access healthcare at the point that they need it without cost being a barrier, for example. Were we to put the right to health in the Constitution, for example, that would be the guarantee, if you like, around access to healthcare, and it would be the standard against which we could judge the forthcoming healthcare reforms from government. On housing, what we're talking about is the right to adequate housing, and it's about ensuring that government, for example, put in place adequate levels of social housing so that the housing in the country reflects the needs of the people in that country and the people are not living in inadequate housing. It's a framework to guide government's delivery of policy and services and ensure that there's a way for individuals who are not receiving that required level of services have a way to say to government, hey, hang on, you said you would protect these rights and you're failing to deliver on them, and a way to hold government to account over time.
Sure. Isn't that coming into conflict with what I would call the paradigm of the economic system, which in itself breeds inequality?
Well, without going into the paradigm of the economic system, I think what's important to remember is that these rights do not say that government has to deliver them overnight or that it has to spend every penny it has on a particular area. What it says is that it has to deliver those rights progressively over time and using the maximum available resources that are available to it. So it's about identifying, well, what are the needs in relation to health or housing, for example, and how do we deliver them in a way that protects the most vulnerable, but doesn't discriminate against people in the protection of that right. And then looking at, well, what resources can we use to address that right and deliver it over time. So what it is about fundamentally is ensuring that state resources are used to deliver on the human rights that government has voluntarily signed up to. And I think that's one of the things we have to remember is that this is not something the government was forced to do. Successive governments have signed up to Ireland's human rights commitments and it's time to actually deliver upon them. Last
but by no means least, something that was, when I mentioned the original constitution, I talked about men and women, and we've taken most of those religious provisions out of the constitution, particularly Article 44. We still seem to have a constitution where if we have men and women, essentially the state defines gender. Would you see the role of a constitutional convention to examine that issue?
Well, the Convention already has a mandate to examine the provision in the Constitution around the role of women in the home and also how to increase women's participation in politics. And those are very welcome issues to be on the agenda of the Convention. But I think more generally, I think we have to look at how the Constitution does or doesn't discriminate against different groups, whether gender or otherwise. Now, it's not about defining the meaning of gender, but ensuring that there isn't discrimination on the basis of gender, for example. And that would be one of the things that perhaps would be considered by the Constitutional Convention. For Amnesty, the priority is making sure that economic, social and cultural rights are examined by the Convention and making sure that those rights are protected for all people living in Ireland without discrimination.
Sure. Last but by no means least, we hear lots of talk about the smart economy. It seems, I can appreciate there's a limitation on how many people you can get in a room and how many people you would realistically want speaking, but there's no reason why the rest of us can't be out there with our YouTube or our Facebook links and saying, yes, I agree with that, and if you like, aggregating the views that are coming in rather than just the old closed talk shop. How do you feel about that, Rosalind?
Well, there's no magic model for constitutional review processes, and absolutely it's welcome that there's a public participation element of this. Now, our understanding is that from government is that the proceedings of the Constitutional Convention will be webcast, that all information will be available on a website. But I think it has to go beyond that. I think in terms of the Convention has to look at how it does engage with people outside of that room, to talk to people about the issues at hand or some of the discussion that's taking place, and make sure that the Constitutional Convention is a debate that doesn't just take place amongst that 100 people over the course of perhaps a year, but actually it's a conversation that we all have to have about our constitution in Ireland, what it should protect and what we want to change about it.
Yes, well, to quote one of the famous senators at the National Forum on Europe, and they were constantly telling us to vote yes to this and yes to that. Some people see a plan, or some people see a plot, I see a plan. So Rosalind McKenna will decide in due course whether it's a plot, a plan or a fudge. But thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.